Well, welcome to the second session. It's a session that title of this session is The Duke of Parma, the Organization of the Document Witnesses. And the speakers are João Dionísio and Maria Souza. João Dionísio teaches at the School of Art and Humanities and is a researcher of the Center of Linguistics of the University of Lisbon. His current interests are focused on the interaction between textual materiality and hermeneutics. He published several volumes of the critical genetic edition of Fernando Pessoa's works directed by Ivo Castro, as well as Fernando Pessoa et al., Lisboa, 2021. His most recent publication include the edition of Eduardo Lourenço's O Labirinto Saudade, 2023, and of Almeida Garrett Frei Luís de Souza, 2022. He was the president of the European Society of Textual Scholarship in 2013-2016. Maria Souza has a degree to Portuguese Studies and is current MA student in textual criticism at the School of Arts and Humanities of Lisbon, University of Lisbon. She took a complementary course in text revision at the school, deepening her knowledge of genetic editing and digital humanities with the digital humanities computer-assisted genetic editing from medieval manuscripts to born digital documents course at the University of Antwerp. She currently teaches Portuguese to secondary school students who are not native speakers of this language. Please, João and Maria, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I think you can hear me. Yeah, okay. So Maria João and I would like to thank Professor Enrico Martinez, Professor Andrea Ragusa, and Carlota De Feno, the organizers of this meeting, for having us. We look forward to hearing Sakari Katayamaki's comments and to discuss our presentation with all of you. Of course, compared with the last session, this will be very, very basic. In the guise of preliminary warning, we should state that what we are about to present is closer to a report than to a paper. It has the outlook of a description rather than of a narrative. It is flat in tone. Only here and there is it openly interpretive. Therefore, it is bound to be tedious, if not soporific. So we ask your indulgence, be patient, and bear with us. When we gave the title to this presentation, Enrico Martinez asked us whether we were considering organization according to the writer or to the inventory team that classified Pessoa's papers. We answered Enrico's query by stating that we would like to address both. Here is the outline of our paper. We first look into the ways that Pessoa arranged the Duke of Parma papers. Then we will see how he used some materials that were originally used in projects associated with one of his literary alter egos, Alexander Serge. And in the end, we close with some remarks on the organization of documents at the National Library of Portugal in the 1970s. Let us start with Pessoa's arrangement of these papers. Materially speaking, we can divide the extant documents into three types: textual fragments, section organizers, and project organizer. Textual fragments are usually found in sheets of paper or parts of these. Section organizers are typically found also in sheets of paper folded once. And the only example we found of what could be labeled a project organizer is an envelope. Hierarchically, this means that there is a number of textual fragments in each section organizer, as all section organizers should be enclosed in the project organizer. This is more or less a representation of that hierarchy. What are the features of the basic unit, the one that contains more or less developed text of the play or about the play? We can highlight a few of them. According to the support material, these units can be full or fragmentary. Full if the support material has been kept in its original size, fragmentary if it was cut into smaller writing surfaces. As to the text itself, it can be approached in accordance with several criteria, namely length, mode of inscription, category, and status. What we mean by this? Taking length into account, the Duke of Parma documents contain text ranging from a few words to the development of scenes that take several pages. The main modes of inscription are pencil and pen handwriting, much more frequent than typing, both original and carbon copied. We use the word category to profile the type of text that is written down in the accent documents. The large majority consists of text of the drama, but a few documents contain the list of characters, scenarios, and synopsis. Finally, as far as status is concerned, we are interested in identifying where in the chain of the genetic dossier do these documents fit. We think that most documents can be placed provisionally under one of these three statuses: rough drafts, copied, revised drafts, and less assuredly, clean copies. A good example of a rough draft can be found in this document. On the left, next to a crux that signals Pessoa's doubt about the phrasing in this section of the text, he added a note, "Put this better." Turning our eyes to the right, there is text added on the margin preceded by the conjunction "or," which underscores the unfinished status of these lines. Let's move to revised rough drafts. What you are seeing is a typed text in which two characters intervene, the Duke of Parma first, then Alberto, and then again the Duke. None of these three parts is complete, as shown by the space left blank. Blank spaces function as general indicators of missing text and of the length of the text that is missing. While it is not impossible that Pessoa typed directly this portion of the play, we feel more inclined to think that it results from a copy of a previously drafted passages, facilitating immensely the reading of the text. Finally, what can we say about clean copies? One telling example of the difficulties elicited by the analysis of a text without any textual suppression, addition, or displacement can be seen here. This is also a typed text conveying a dialogue between two characters, the Duke and Girolamo. But unlike the previous example, there are no blank spaces left or corrections apart from an irrelevant hesitation on the first line of the speech by the Duke. Sorrow of or sorrow at the essence of the world. Still, this impeccable outlook is overturned by a comment that Pessoa added on top: too strained. Comments such as this remind us that Pessoa is an annotator of his own writings, as he is of other authors. For the sake of an example among many, see Pessoa's annotation to a poem by Alfred Tennyson in an anthology of sonnets studied by Carlos Pitella. On the top of the printed poem, Pessoa wrote, "Indifferent." We turn now to materials that, for the sake of brevity, were previously named section organizers. They mostly accommodate the documents that convey text associated with one of the 5 acts into which the play was divided. This is evident in the checkered sheets of paper that bear indication of each act, from 1 to 5. Note that each of these sheets still shows the crease where they were folded in half to assemble different sets of documents. There are 2 other documents that seemingly play a similar function of assembling materials sharing a common denominator, but were not designed to contain materials specifically related to each act. The first one here bears the general indication Duke of Parma on the one side and on the other a remark in Portuguese about certain features of three characters in the play: Valerio, the Duchess, and Count Alberto. We can only guess what documents were assembled in this fragmentary sheet of paper. In contrast, there are safe grounds to identify what was inside another section organizer, recycled from a flyleaf that was probably extracted from a notebook or from a book. The folding mark in the middle is less visible than in other documents. On the right side, between two parallel lines, one reads in Portuguese, para escolher, to choose from. We'll say more on this towards the end of our paper. Finally, as all folded sheets containing the remaining materials of the Genesis of the Duke of Parma were supposed to be enclosed in an envelope, as far as we know, only one envelope survived. On one side, it displays the title of the play between parallel lines. Apart from it, two verse lines in English, and below a title, Conquest of Granada, repeated and crossed over, which maybe is an allusion to Pessoa's interest in John Dryden's tragedy bearing that title, along with a few words we failed to read. The other side of the envelope was left in blank. Accommodating papers in envelopes and packages was a frequent practice in Pessoa's way of organizing his materials. The most iconic photograph of his private library and the trunk way he used to keep his papers is telling in this regard. The trunk is filled up to the top with envelopes and packages, and at least in one case it is still possible to figure out a title on the envelope. Orfeu, that is, the title of the Portuguese modernist literary magazine that Pessoa directed in 1915. Therefore, we can imagine that sometime in the past, at least, an envelope with the materials related to the Duke of Parma could be found in this trunk, or else in a suitcase, or in a cabinet, in which Pessoa also kept some of his papers. These envelopes and packages did not have the same size, and size matters. What we will do next has to do with size and is inspired by Paulius Subacius' article on the Lithuanian preacher Silvestras Gimzauskas. Several of Gimzauskas' handwritten notes were inscribed in support materials folded in order to fit a cassock pocket. Our following remarks are less sartorial in kind, but they seek to find a material link between Pessoa's remaining materials and the surviving envelope. According to the information provided by the inventory team, the extant envelope measures around 152 millimeters wide and 220 millimeters long. Given the wear that the envelope has undergone, its original dimensions no longer correspond to those observed today. However, its measures seem to correspond to C5 envelopes designed to accommodate A5 sheets of paper. When we look at the size of all the documents, although they have rather different dimensions, all seem to fit the C5 envelope. And even A4 materials do, because they were folded in half, as shown in this slide. Indeed, size matters even more than the type of support material, as can be seen here. A sequence of documents numbered on the upper left. Text that is found on page 10 follows from what we read on page 9, and whereas the support material changed from blank low-quality sheets to checkered ones, the size is always A5. So we may assume that A5 is really the pattern, be it the result of an A4 cut into two halves, or an A4 folded once, or a bifolium folded twice. Even though all documents seem to fit the surviving envelope, it must be said that it is less certain that this very envelope could contain all next to 200 sheets of paper that make up the Duke of Parma corpus today. With this doubt in mind, let us have a look at how Pessoa assembled the corpus. Such question is not without interest, since he was usually working in different literary and non-literary projects at the same time. It can be safely affirmed that from an undetermined moment on, Pessoa wrote down a number of textual fragments with a view to the making of a play titled The Duke of Parma. A preliminary observation of these fragments suggests that some of them received the same title as the plays in its full or abbreviated form. This, however, deserves a second look. If these fragments were published in Pessoa's lifetime, none of them would come out bearing the title Duke of Parma or the abbreviation D of P. Instead, it is likely that they would receive a heading in the vein of the fragments from Livro do Sossego, as in this example, or so the title in this case would be something like Passage from Book of Disquiet, composed by Bernardo Soares, bookkeeper assistant in the city of Lisbon. Or as is the case with some poems taken from the cycle Cancioneiro, from a songbook. Idest, the following are pieces extracted from a songbook. In both cases, the texts that came out were titled with the preposition from at center stage, a prose passage taken from the Book of Disquiet, and a series of poems taken from a cycle titled Songbook. Accordingly, we may perhaps say that each fragment of the Duke of Parma, had it been published in Pessoa's lifetime, would be titled in a similar way. This brings us to the nature of these indications above several textual fragments that pertain to the Duke of Parma project. They have the outlook of opening titles, but they are not opening titles. In our view, they perform a function similar to the one performed by running titles or heads in book format. What we have in mind can already be seen in medieval manuscripts. Take this example from a medieval codex that contains a copy of a Latin translation of 3 treatises by Aristotle: the Topica, the Sophistici Elenchi, and the Analytica Priora and Posteriora. As one consults the text, there is a reading aid at the top of each page conveying the abbreviated title of each work: Topi for Topica, Ellen for Sophistici Elenchi, and Pri for Analytica Priora. In a miscellaneous codex such as this, it is a device that permanently situates the reader and helps him locate the part of the manuscript he intends to go through. In Pessoa's case, the place ascribed to these references is the same as in the codex, the upper part of the page, and the function attributed to them is similar when one realizes that his is a miscellaneous work of sorts, made up of many writing projects, more or less contemporary. So this is somewhat the equivalent. When these projects gain traction, it is useful to label the document witnesses according to a shared destination, textual but also material. A, these papers will be assembled inside a folded sheet of paper or an envelope. These papers contain text that will in the future be part of the Duke of Parma. Or B, these papers will be assembled inside a folded sheet of paper or an envelope. These labels are frequently abbreviations of a general designation. As far as our play is concerned, the abbreviations are rather similar to the one Pessoa used for the Book of Disquiet: L do D, D of P. Or, slightly less contracted, Duke D of Parma, or in its almost full form, Duke of Parma, without the initial determiner. In some documents, abbreviations such as these are placed after the fragment, the position eliciting 2 interpretations. One, it was evident from the start to Pessoa's mind that that fragment belonged to the Duke of Parma, and the label was added later in order to facilitate the assembling of all documents pertaining to the same project. Or, second hypothesis, it was not evident from the start that they belonged to the project, the decision having been made later on. Both these interpretations are applicable to these 2 cases, the first showing the label inscribed by a different writing device, first in pen then in pencil, and the second by the same device. which also penned the dot shaped in 3 question marks. We now get to the second part of this presentation, dedicated to the connection between the Duke of Parma and one of Pessoa's literary alter egos, Alexander Serge. The type of checkered paper that Pessoa used for the fair transcriptions of Serge's poems was also employed in the writing of several documents belonging to the Duke of Parma dossier. More so, some documents associated with Serge were actually reused in the genetic process of the play. One significant case of recycling Serge's materials is the way Pessoa reused one checkered sheet of paper that was originally taken with a clean copy of Serge's poems. That is what happens here. The upper part of the cover for the cycle of poems titled Delirium and attributed to Alexander Serge was penciled on the back with text designed to become part of the Duke of Parma. This case is relevant to matters of chronology. According to a list of poems to be included in Delirium, the more recent piece is The Maiden of Dreams, dated the 29th December 1907, and bearing the indication copied. This suggests that a relevant stage in the composition of the Duke of Parma was being written in 1908. A different example of this reprocessing operation is this list of characters, starting with the Duke of Parma himself and ending with Hermione, the maid, before a few barely visible remarks. This is also, or was previously, an envelope sent to Alexander Serge, which was recycled to this end. There are some other examples of Pessoa's practice of sending letters to his own address, including the name of Alexander Serge as addressee. This must have happened sometime between 1907 and 1909, when Pessoa was living with his great aunts in Rua da Bela Vista Lapa in Lisbon, and this is a quote from Ana Maria Freitas. Apart from that, it is a well-known fact. After the return of Pessoa's family to Durban in May 1907, Pessoa moves again to the house of his great aunts, Maria and Rita, this time in Rua da Bela Vista Lapa, number 17, first floor, where his paternal grandmother also lives. In November 1909, he moves to Rua da Glória, number 4, ground floor, etc. Since Alexander Serge seems at least indirectly so important to the Duke of Parma project, it is perhaps convenient to present this authorial figure even if very briefly. On one of these now well-known checkered sheets, Pessoa gave the following description of him, which is very much coincident with Pessoa's own life or biographical traits, at least the year of the birth date. Born June 13, 1888 at Lisbon, task, all not the province of the other three, and these other three are other three authorial figures Pessoa made up. One, the Portuguese regicide and the political situation in Portugal, the philosophy of rationalism, the mental disorder of Jesus, delirium, agony. Note the Portuguese regicide and the idea of assassinating the Duke. We meet the hypothesis that Serge's task of writing on rationalism, and above all on the collapse of the rational mind, is indicative of Pessoa's frame of mind when he set out to write the Duke of Parma. Additionally, it is worth recalling that among Pessoa's made-up authorial figures, Serge is the only one whose name is signed on a few books of his private library, as if he had been the owner of those books. One of these is Regeneration, a reply to Max Nordau, that is, to Nordau's study Degeneration, in which he claims that fin de siècle society and art are going through an intense decay, manifesting itself in symptoms such as world weariness. Several fragments of the Duke of Parma convey this atmosphere of world weariness. And now, over to Maria.
Good afternoon. Well, okay. To conclude, we will give a very tentative overview of how the archivists at the National Library of Portugal organize the Duke of Parma materials. We will start by watching a short TV news piece about it, if I manage to... Okay. This is about the acquisition of Pessoas materials by the state.
44 anos. Durante a sua vida, que foi curta, escreveu uma obra grande, da qual parte já foi publicada. 28.000 documentos, a maior parte dos quais originais, constituem um espólio riquíssimo que a Secretaria de Estado da Cultura adquiriu. Inclui os manuscritos de toda a obra já publicada, exceto o livro Mensagem, cujos originais desapareceram. Mensagem foi, aliás, a única obra publicada durante a vida de Pessoa. Dos numerosos inéditos, partem ainda prosa e poesia em inglês. No contrato estabelecido entre a família do poeta e a Secretaria de Estado da Cultura, é expressa a prioridade de acesso da obra aos intelectuais que a estudem. Só depois de se organizarem os documentos e de se fazerem microfilmagens dos manuscritos...
So you can see here... You could have said it before. Okay, then I think I'll move along. Okay. The video showed the organization of Pessoa's papers. He had his documents in envelopes in his famous arca, the wood trunk that you might be familiar with. Professor Dionisio showed a little picture of it. And so the archivists decided to emulate Pessoa's way of organizing his documents by also placing them in envelopes. And each of these envelopes would be named according to a title or a description of its contents, apart from a numeric or alphanumeric code. So the front surface of these envelopes has been kept, and so we know that the Duke of Parma materials were identified in containers like this. It is also known that the archivists, whenever possible, assembled and identified Pessoa's papers according to the organization of the Attica edition, that is the Vulgate publishers of Pessoa's works since 1942. However, in the case of his dramatic texts, Attica issued a single publication in 1956 titled Poemas Dramáticos, which did not include any of Pessoa's English fragmentary dramas. Although it is far from certain, maybe this points to the possibility that the organization of Pessoa's works that have to do with his drama output in English was closer to the author's pristine organization than other sets of texts. Incidentally, a note on the cover of some documents gives credit to this hypothesis. The note says, "O próprio autor juntou estes originais com indicação para separar." So the author himself assembled these originals with the indication to keep apart. And later, this was corrected to, instead, to keep apart to choose from. The correction is to the point, as we can see in this image. So isolated a set of documents from which you would select an undetermined number to distribute according to the act each would belong to. Fortunately, the archivists identified precisely the documents that made up this corpus. It's 46 documents, 1 typewritten, and 45 handwritten. This seems to hint to the possibility that the first envelope contains more stabilized text and the second envelope contains more incipient or inserted materials. So there's 2 envelopes. Envelope 4 is organized by acts, and that seems more stabilized, and then envelope 5 has the subsection to choose from. Without surprise, a document such as this one, displaying a doubt on whether it should belong to the Duke of Parma, is found within this set. Moving towards the close of our presentation, we would like to share with you, as if in a bird's eye view, some features of the present organization of the Duke of Parma papers. It somehow confirms or moderates some of the hypotheses we have been making so far. So this is a representation of all the fragments we worked with, and on top you have envelope 4, and on the bottom you have envelope 5. As mentioned, there are different categories of text in the Duke of Parma materials. Some documents serve as containers, the project and section organizers, here identified as structural documents, and others contains lists of characters, scenarios, synopses, plot outlines, here identified as informative, that is, documents that contain information about the play. Since envelope 4 was organized by acts, it has 5 structural documents, each corresponding to one of the 5 acts of the play. And it has not a lot, only 2 informative pieces. Most of the text in envelope 4 belongs to the drama itself, divided between the acts. Envelope 5, on the other hand, contains only 1 structural document to choose from, and it has many, many more informative materials. They make up for roughly 10% of the fragments. When we look at the documents according to the structure of the Duke of Parma, there are 3 types. First, there's the ones that we know with certainty to which act they belong to, since Pessoa left explicit indications in this regard. For example, Act 5, last scene. These are here represented in green and comprise slightly less than 10% of the corpus. You can see that there is a similar rate of such documents in envelope 4 and 5. The second type consists of the text found in other documents, which, though not explicitly localized within the structure by Pessoa, it can be reasonably linked to a certain act. This is due to the characters in the scene and their topic of conversation in comparison to the several plot outlines and planning notes that Pessoa made for the play. And these are here represented in yellow and comprise 25% of the corpus. You can see there are many more fragments with inferred localization in envelope 4 than in envelope 5, almost 5 times more. So it's 40% versus 8.4%. This is because envelope 5 accommodates many short fragments, many of them without identified characters, which makes it harder to place the text they convey within the structure. It makes sense that the textual fragments in envelope 4, which are seemingly arranged by act, are more developed, more complex, and consequently easier to localize within the structure. At last, there are materials that cannot be surely assigned to a specific act, and you can see there's a lot of them. It's more than 50%, it's 56%. They are here represented in red. As you can see, they are more numerous in envelope 5 than in envelope 4. Envelope 5 indeed holds more documents conveying isolated sentences, monologues by the Duke about very vague themes, and dialogues between the Duke and non-identified characters. The unfinished nature of these fragments makes them harder to place within the 5-act structure. So, the data we collected enabled us to look at the organization of these documents under other angles that were not mentioned in this talk, but we have to wrap up. Over 40 years, Pessoa's family house was open to scholars and researchers who intended to work on the papers he left behind. Our uneducated guess is that some of these documents, the ones that were not at the origin of any publication during these decades, are likely to let observers see aspects of the pristine, thorough organization. Against this backdrop, here are a few concluding remarks. First, many documents that convey text belonging to each of the 5 acts of the Duke of Parma are correctly located after the due act organizer. But there are some exceptions to this rule. I can show you here. You can see there's like where it should be only Act 2, there's an Act 1, and there should be Act 3, there's an Act 5. So there are some exceptions that are caused either by authorial hesitation or by the intrusion of the National Library archivists. Besides, a large number of materials was simply kept apart, so not knowing precisely what to do with them. Generally speaking, the overall distribution of the papers into the 2 envelopes pays justice to this frontier between situated texts and non-situated texts. Second, the close connection between a specific stage in the development of Alexander Serge's output and the Duke of Parma is chronologic, material, and subject-oriented. But relevance given in both projects to decay and madness is not enough to explain Serge's signature in a book that argues against Max Nordau's theory of degeneration. And third, to conclude, the digitization that served as the basis of the initiative directed by Enrico Martínez does not provide all available and needed data. Presential analysis at Pessoa's archive is mandatory. We would not be in a position to determine the status of several documents if we had not had access to comments by the archivists on the actual materials that were kept inside a given section organizer. Additionally, this illustrates the archival nature of this writing and therefore their resistance to relaxed editorial actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now is time for the discussant of this session.
If I say when you change.
Do you need to? Okay. That is the Professor Sakari Katamaki. That is Associate Professor, Managing Editor and of Edit Critical Edition of Finnish Literature at the Finnish Literature Society, and President of the European Society for Textual Scholarship. He is a literary critic and textual scholar whose research interests include nonsense literature, translation history, the scholarly editing of 19th century literature, and the methodology of textual scholarship. He is current PI of the research project Traces of Translation in the Archives and is involved in several editorial projects on 19th century Finnish literature. Katajamiaki is a founding member of the Genesis Conference series and has served as co-editor of Genetic Criticism in Motion, New Perspectives on Manuscript Studies, 2023. Please, yeah. The floor is yours.
Dear organizers, dear Jean and Maria, dear Simon, let me begin by warmly thanking you for the kind invitation to Parma. I cannot claim to be a Pessoa specialist, yet I suppose that by the time I board my flight back to Finland, I will know far more about his work than I did only yesterday. I would also like to congratulate Enrico and all those involved in the project for an undertaking that successfully integrates expertise from a range of fields and that resonates strongly with contemporary cultural interests and intellectual trends. One might ask what could be a more appropriate moment for exploring such complex questions of identity as those found in Pessoa's writing. Equally, contemporary scholarly paradigms are increasingly capable of addressing the multilingual dimensions of literature and of digitally mastering the kinds of complex archival and textual challenges of which the Duke of Parma case is full. In teaching, I have observed a remarkable interest among students in fragmentary texts. It is perhaps worth noting that only a few years ago, one might have been hard-pressed to imagine that novellis fragments might seem attractive to young readers. I have been steeped in many academic broths over the years, yet this chance to establish a professional connection with your Duke of Parma project feels like something of a long-term milestone for me. When I began my career as a scholarly editor and textual scholar, I often hoped to encounter unknown or lost literary treasures that would bring a genuine sense of adventure to my work. Perhaps nothing quite on the scale of Indiana Jones or the adventures of the librarian, but something with a hint of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over the past 20 years, I have indeed encountered a wide variety of unique materials. However, since much of my work has focused on the papers of well-known authors and established works, I have never come across a true scoop. Today, working with the Duke of Parma material, I find myself closer to the thrill of the Dead Sea Scrolls than ever before. On my return to Helsinki, I'll tip my fedora and tell my colleagues, been there, done that. In my talk, I do not aim to examine the paper in exhaustive detail or to be an opponent. Pessoa specialists could do that far better than I ever could. Instead, I wish to focus on a few points that I believe have broader relevance for textual scholarship and manuscript studies. Given this approach, I will be speaking from a bird's-eye perspective in which Joao's and Maria's study appears particularly rich and thought-provoking. Looking from above, I perceive their study as divided into three overlapping areas. The first two legs of this tripod structure are first, organizing without text, and second, organizing through labeling. These modes of organization are often combined when documents are grouped and preserved in various ways. As you have already heard, these perspectives, which at first glance may seem trivial, commonplace, or even rather dull, prove to be theoretically rich and highly stimulating. The Duke of Parma archival material demonstrates that organizing is not merely a practical issue, but also a theoretical challenge, and that labeling in fragmentary material calls for careful reflection. The third leg of the tripod is made up of multiple angles for observing the organizing together with reference points that help us make sense of it. Most of these angles have a dual character. On the other hand, they concern the factual material aspects of the documents, such as the type or size of the paper or the material qualities of the writing. These selective analytical observations are supported by the document info pages of the digital archive. At the same time, these material qualities also open onto interpretative questions concerning Pessoa's writing processes, archival practices, and their relationship to Pessoa's oeuvre from the Duke of Parma to other writings. The draft version that Joao and Maria kindly sent me in advance was full of careful observations, deep thinking, and impressive results addressing their challenging research objectives. At the same time, it had not yet reached broader theoretical conclusions. It is therefore my pleasure to build on their observations, to enjoy the empirical buffet they have prepared, and to reflect freely without having to undertake all the heavy groundwork myself or worry about the project's practical boundaries. At this point, it is important to note that the organization of documents and texts is a topic that runs from the earliest stages of our research materials through to our own research practices and their outcomes. Despite this fundamental relevance, organization has received surprisingly little attention at the theoretical level. Archival theory forms a notable exception where organization is often treated as a high level of abstraction and commonly in relation to administrative documents. As Joao's and Maria's paper shows, the study of organizing is related to a variety of reference frameworks. These may include, for example, the author's life stages and biographical research, the chronology of the texts, genetic aspects of writing, textual criticism and editorial work, literary critical studies, as well as archival practices and the practices of transcribing and digital archiving. This list could be easily extended in multiple directions from geography to cognition. Taken together, these frameworks demonstrate that Joao's and Maria's research topic engages centrally with a wide range of scholarly perspectives and questions. Reading your text has led me to think about organizing, materiality, and labeling in a far richer and more multifaceted way than I had before. For that, I'm most grateful. Let me now turn to some specific aspects that I found particularly intriguing, which I believe raise questions of a broader methodological and theoretical interest. To begin with, I would like to draw attention to the ways in which archival praxis and archival theory has developed in recent years, offering new perspectives on the study of fragmentary archival materials of this kind, and perhaps new contexts within which to reflect upon the organization of the Duke of Parma papers. In this regard, I'm thinking especially of RIC, records in contexts, the latest conceptual model and standard for the description of records. It is maintained by the International Council of Archives. The first version of it was released in 2023. I will not go into the technicalities of the standard, which lie beyond my own area of expertise. That said, RIC both emerges from substantial theoretical debates within archival studies and has, in turn, stimulated further methodological reflection. What seems particularly interesting in the present context is RIC's fundamentally relational approach rather than following the traditional top-down hierarchical model. It is fully decentralized, situating records within a network of interrelated contexts. Traditional hierarchies can still be represented, but they are treated just one element among many in describing a record's broader context. More specifically, the 2023 RIC documents Foundations of Archival Description and the Conceptual Model explore the concept of provenance and highlight aspects that encourage us to rethink the contexts of archival material, not least when dealing with fragmentary documents. As historical background, the RIC documents note that, I quote, "The principle of provenance emerged in the 19th century and over the course of the century became established as the foundation of archival theory and practice in the modern West." They go into identify the two well-established principles of provenance. The first is respect des fonds, meaning that, I quote, "The records created, accumulated, and used by a person or group in the course of life and work are to be kept together and not intermixed with records from other sources." The second is respect for original order, which, I quote, "recognizes that the intellectual grouping of and sequencing imposed on the records in the context of accumulation and use is essential to understanding the interrelations among them as well as being evidence of how they are used." What is particularly innovative in the RIC documents is the critical reflection of these principles. For instance, the documents note, I quote, "The records in a fonds do not exist only in relation to the fonds, nor does the fonds exist in isolation. Both the fonds and the records contained in it exist in layers of interconnected contexts, past, present, and future." The RIC model also recognizes that records may, in fact, be reordered and more than once. What does order mean, they ask? Does it mean the physical arrangement of the records or their intellectual relation to one another? Increasingly, order is understood as, first and foremost, the intellectual relations among the records, and secondarily, if at all, the physical arrangement of the records. Another important point, as stated in the documents is, I quote, "Both the respect the fond and the respect for original order are archival principles, not records management principles. Both are retrospective, whereas in the originating context of creation and use, the perspective of a person managing his or her own records or the perspective of a designed records manager is focused on the immediate needs of the person or the group." Finally, the RIC documents offer a broader definition of provenance that resonates particularly well with the current case study. I quote, "A fuller understanding must include recognizing that provenance is much more complex than the origins and history of records include not only the person or group that accumulated a body of records, but also other persons and groups directly related to the records and the activities that were and are being performed in relation to the records. In practice, it may not be feasible in the context of this case study to engage in detailed dialogue with the RIC model, but nevertheless referring to the model can be useful as it demonstrates just how topical the question of organization remains in contemporary archival theory. Another aspect relevant to your study concerns the larger archival contexts of the Duke of Parma corpus. You touch upon these contexts in various ways, yet I would be curious to hear more about the surroundings of these fragments, because both their former historical contexts and their current archival environs form important backgrounds for the organization of the corpus. I'm conducting a research project entitled Traces of Translation in the Archives, which examines translation-related archives in Finnish archival institutions. When launching the project, it soon became clear to us that many of the central research questions extend beyond the archival documents themselves and into the broader contexts in which they are situated and from which they emerge, and even into the world beyond the archives, most of which never finds its way into any archival repository. Building on these reflections, I have often employed the metaphor drawn from gold mining. I have compared the archival conditions of translation-related material to so-called sluice box, a device to trap heavier gold particles as water washes the gold-bearing soil that has been shoveled into it. In reality, much of the surrounding soil is never shoveled into the sluice box, metaphorically speaking, the archive, and even when it is, a considerable portion is sifted out. What remains is the material deemed sufficiently valuable to be preserved and organized within the archive. And even then, only part of it, what the sluice box captures, is ever consulted or brought into scholarly use. Applied to your case study, I would like to encourage you to reflect further on the practical conditions that preceded the formation of the archive. At the same time, it would be valuable to learn more about how these two envelopes relate to Pessoa's personal archive and its history. Pessoa's general author archiving practices are also particularly noteworthy. Questions related to fragmentary material are usually more difficult and speculative, but all the more stimulating. One key issue in studying fragmentary material, such as the Duke of Parma, is the temporal angle from which the material is organized and labeled, a concern that is particularly significant for fragmentary texts, where questions of order, sequence, and interpretation are inherently complex. This involves both the way the material and its labels are arranged and the perspective from which they are interpreted. More precisely, it involves a retrospective gaze on the material as well as a future-oriented perspective regarding its potential use and scholarly interpretation. I think your paper engages with both aspects, but you might be even more explicit and reflective about them, including your own inevitably retrospective gaze on the material. The temporal perspective shapes not only the organization of the material, but also the interpretation in relation to Pessoa's other writings. Similarly, the use of the Attica edition in archival practice represents a retrospective orientation toward the material. I do not have any concrete suggestions here, but I believe this is a general issue that is highly relevant to your study. Regarding Joao's and Maria's article, I noticed that different forces began to contend in my mind. This is a good sign, for it is when struggles occur that the thoughts themselves begin to move. Perhaps my self-reflective observations are as a reader can also suggest some useful ideas or associations while working on the text. If they do not, there is no harm done. For example, I noticed just how text-oriented I am as a reader. The paper, by emphasizing the documents rather than the texts themselves, which is unquestionably one of its strengths, felt both healthy and refreshing. It allowed me to focus on the materiality of the documents and to observe how easily I slipped into thinking about the texts and the questions of transcribing them. When I realized that I was reflecting on Pessoa's writings, I also became aware of a certain tension in my reading, a genetic gaze versus a text-critical gaze. The genetic approach aligned closely with the content of the paper, yet I often found myself considering how the play might be edited from a text-critical perspective. The concept of organizing felt very different depending on whether the emphasis lay on the physical documents, their genesis, or their potential as sources for scholarly edition. For me, these intuitive reactions demonstrate that this study is relevant to multiple methodological approaches and how lively a debate it can be sparked in the mind of a reader. You might consider whether it would be useful to reflect on such areas of application at the beginning or the end of the article. I must admit that my work as a textual scholar has not led me into heroic battles in India or Egypt, nor to outrunning collapsing temples. Instead, the battles are fought in my mind, armed with a keyboard or a carefully sharpened set of concepts. The dust that rises from these encounters is archival or theoretical rather than archaeological. Yet such moments possess that same capacity to quicken the pulse and to remind us why we entered this profession in the first place. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Then we have a good time for debate. And I don't know if you know, if you want to begin with.
Okay.
Why not?
No, just on a very quick note. First, I think Maria and I would very much like to thank Sakari for his response to our paper. I think we learned a lot, but I think we would like to have access to the text itself. Just a short remark on one of your last passages about the difference between the genetic perspective and the critical perspective. And thank you very much for that note. One of the unforeseen things we talked about, unforeseen because when Maria started transcribing with my assistance, we were only having access to the digitized photos of the documents. It was on a second thought that we decided, no, let's go to the archive itself and see what is there besides the Pessoa documents. And we realized that the archive keeps memory of certain organizational actions that otherwise we don't see. That, if we take that for granted, and I think we can take that for granted, that is what enables any one of us to see that at a given point, Pessoa made a clear distinction between the materials that were to use a word that was also used by Jerónimo, Nicolás, and Carlos, a clear distinction between stabilized materials and non-stable materials. Stable in the sense that roughly 75% of the documents had reached a given status, and 25% is a relevant, a very relevant rate. Those 25% did not have the same status. And that is not indifferent if we consider the genetic work with that in mind, because it apparently means that when the two envelopes, so to say, reached the inventory organizers at the National Library, that divide mattered to the author, and that has some sort of impact. So one of the things that maybe is a practical generalizing conclusion is that it is not, it is very useful to go back to the archive presentially and extract the memory of those actions and see how they impact on a number of initiatives. But thank you very much for that. Okay.
Thank you. Then, please, Carlos.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I love this last note you just made. Can you hear me fine? I'm very loud.
No. I think that is better.
I might be too loud.
The room is too huge.
Hi. I love this last note about returning to the archive physically to be able to see, because not everything has been digitized. As you noted, the note by the organizers, the people who made the inventory, about the number of documents is absolutely precious. I found that with Fausto was the same thing. I had to find some of those notes that were microfilmed but not digitized, were particularly precious for understanding this posthumous history of the archive after Pessoa passed. And I love the insight about the Attica edition that you presented. Of course, the English theater hadn't been published by Attica, so the hypothesis is, would that have been closer to the way Pessoa left the archive? And I think it's a very valid hypothesis. I think it's brilliant and very helpful. I also loved your slides. You mentioned they might be tedious. They are not at all. The slides were fantastic. I love the dimensions you shared about the A4, A3. I actually want you to go back to the slides so I can take a photo later before you leave. I have a question regarding another aspect of materiality that we didn't talk about too much. You showed one paper that had a great, beautiful watermark, the Mohican Bond. Some linen, some laid paper that Pessoa used. I wonder if those other marks are also helpful, or if you found that, because they were extremely helpful for Marino, I'm not sure if they would be helpful for the Duke of Parma to understand the not just the let's say, some other elements of the paper were particularly helpful to establish chronology and maybe proximity. I wonder if you got into this already, if there's something that you do, if they're particularly helpful or not.
Okay, thank you very much. We didn't look into watermarks and other material aspects of the archive that could enable us to be rather more specific about the chronology of the genetic process. So I don't know. I think Maria doesn't know, but. What to my mind is interesting is that when, and we keep doing it, when we say that, well, he started this in Jerónimo 1907 or 1906, and he kept on writing and thinking about the project until Hospital de São Luís. That is generally a fair description, but what we should try to do in an accurate way is to follow your path and follow Jerónimo's path and see materially what does this mean. Because if we have around less than 200 documents, and if those 200 documents are the result of, say, 28 years of a long-term process, that can be rounded up to 10 documents per year. That is nothing. So it would be interesting to see what are the intensive periods of working, those periods in which the project is dormant and then re-emerges, and in which way, and why, of course. If we can draw a parallel with Alexander Serge's corpus, what is observable there is that there is a very intensive period of literary creation, and then it is like over. And then it re-emerges, but only very occasionally. And basically, those later moments do not imply any very strong intention of resuming the project. What is curious in this case is that you keep finding reference to the Duke of Parma in a number of lists and projects. So to try and build up this tension between archiving literary intentions as seen in lists and compare them with the material evidence of a project going on, I think that could be very interesting, and the material marks are fundamental as a gateway to go in that direction. But we have not done anything about the material marks.
Just an observation, just to build up, starting from this observation. I noticed that watermark while I was encoding the documents, and then when Carlotta went to the archive, to the library, she did, so she recorded all the watermarks and they were encoded. So like for future investigation, we can build up upon this.
Paper scarce, so he has all these beautiful bank papers that help really specify some periods, what periods before or after. Fascinating.
Yeah, and if I may, I'm sorry, I shared with the Jerónimo a first version of the PowerPoint when some days ago he was in Lisbon. And that is another thing that goes in the direction of what Zachary was pointing out, to try and find traces of the authorial organization that clearly precede the work at the National Library. And what I have in mind is the authorial envelopes, and how many of those authorial envelopes or remnants of those envelopes are still in the archive.
Can I say
Yeah,
something
sure.
about that? I mentioned that in envelope 4, it's divided by acts, right? And the organization by the archivists is, there's 5 divisions by the acts. In envelope 4, there's the subsection to choose from, but there's more 40 documents, I think. And they're also divided. We just don't have the information why, but it might reflect something. I think it would be worth it to look at how they were divided and if they have something in common, because it might reflect the initial SOAS organization. No more questions?
Other questions?
No, lunchtime.
Lunchtime.
Do you mind going back to the slide with the A4 and 5?
Yeah.
You don't need it.
We don't need it. He doesn't want it. What I have to do?
Oh, I'm sorry. I just would love to see this slide with A4, A5, A3 again. If you can find it, it was beautiful, but you moved very fast through it. I want to take a picture of you guys with it. I feel like it gave a good like ruler. You know, when you put a coin in front of an object.
He's refusing.
You can close it.
Can I close? Okay.
Maybe you should close it.
Okay. I will go. It's going to be around here. Okay. Can I make, sorry, final note before we go? There's this like running question of how to do, like, are we doing an edition? Are we doing an archive? Are we able to do an archive? Elena will talk about this later, and I will leave that to her. But you were talking about like reading, looking at the material, and immediately going into thinking like, oh, how can we edit this? And I think it's also relevant that, and I was talking with Professor Dionisio about this, that this is not an edition. I think this is barely a play, and I kind of look at it as it is an archive. We are archiving an archive. It is not a play at all. Like to choose from, it goes into what you said about like an archive. It's important to decide what to keep and what to let go. And that was what Sol was doing. So despite if what we are doing is an archive or not, the thing in itself is not an edition. And lunch?
No other questions? No? Mark.
Okay. I have one question that is related to the idea that the title could be a running title. Maybe João could explain that a little bit more, because I don't think I really understood the point.
This has to do with practical imagination. We know, because it is a fact, that over his life, Pessoa was simultaneously working on very different projects. So one of his material needs as far as organization goes is, regardless of the text and the connection of a given text with a given project, he would have to, in a very functional way, to assemble a number of rather different materials, so to say. So it would be helpful if those materials had a label, a visible label, that would point to the organizers he would have, he could use. So it is against this backdrop that I think that what we tend to see as titles are not really titles, are organizing devices.
Like index words.
Like index words. And he doesn't have to read 5 lines or 4 lines or even 1 line. He can just look at that phrase or word or set of words, and it will immediately enable him to place it on the right spot, inside the right envelope. And so that is the way I see that those are not really head titles or titles in the conventional way we think of them.
So, but when you think of Duke of Parma, how does that work?
Exactly the way I try to describe. He sees D of P as in the book of Disquiet, L of D, and those are displacement, replacement, placement devices. This goes that way, next to that pile of materials related to the Duke of Parma, and this goes that way because that is the set of documents that has to do with the Book of Disquiet and so forth. That's it.
So in terms of using the analysis that you have made to define a sequence, do you think that will help, or there's no way of determining the sequence of the fragments that we have? Well, except for plot or some kind of internal narrative reasons.
Well, that has to do with what we know now. Okay, that says nothing about what we can know in the near future or in the not so near future. Taking into consideration what we know now, I think that is impossible. And just a slight expansion on that. We tend to see plans and lists of topics as the guiding document. And so hierarchically, we were talking about this before, as the guiding document. That document says this goes this way and that goes that way. But actually, we don't know. First of all, the only guiding document that we have within this corpus is very hesitant. Within each act, there are some doubts as to the position of certain scenes, for instance. But besides that, we don't really know if that plan had not been superseded. And so the plan is interesting in itself. It is not interesting as the driving force that would help us determine the position of each document in an editorial sequence. And so we go back again to Sakari's observations regarding archive and to Maria's observations regarding archive. Of course, we can adopt a sequence. We can adopt the archival sequence from document 1 in envelope 4 till the last document in envelope 5. And we can even take that plan as our guide, but that is a fiction. That is an editorial fiction. We don't know, really. And it is telling, I think, that the document is organized backwards. He started with Act 5 and went back till Act 1. And genetically speaking, it is very interesting because it is like a marvelous illustration of teleology, something that geneticians abhor. And so we have a plan starting with the closing scene of the text. But again, it can be very interesting in itself. I don't think it has any practical force as far as the organization of a text, editorially speaking, is concerned. But that is my impression now.
I will get back to this question later. Sorry. I feel like that was the question about Fausto. There was like, for a long time, a lot of importance had been given to the plan, to the point that you wouldn't even see the papers. So Dionisio and I were talking about this during the break. It's like, what importance should we give to those plans? Should they be hierarchical above all the other papers, or should they be seen as just one more fragment to understand the play? And what happens? What are the consequences of each choice?
Can I just, about if it's practical to organize it, like we think not even Pessoa followed his own plans in a way, because when I was comparing the fragments with his plans, there's several that didn't fit into his supposed organization. So how relevant are the plans if Pessoa didn't follow? Exactly, because it changed. We know the characters change, the names of the characters change. Yeah.
We can talk about this forever. I think I would just raise the questions like, does the plan apply to what has been already written, to what you want to write, or maybe something else? So I feel like that's why understanding when the plan was made, when the papers were made is so important, and you can make hypotheses about this. Yeah.
Okay, then there are no other questions? No? Yes, then we can close this session all this wonderful morning. I remember that the afternoon session will begin at 15:30. Okay, thank you once again to our speakers.